Look at your hands right now. Those hands exist because somewhere in the medieval world, a woman survived the most dangerous thing she would ever do. Not a battle, not a plague, giving birth. And here is the part that might surprise you. The way we imagine medieval childbirth, all the screaming and the filth and the helplessness, is mostly wrong. The reality was stranger, more fascinating, and in some ways more sophisticated than anything you have been told. If you are using this to fall asleep tonight, that is perfect. These stories have waited 700 years. They will still be here when you wake up. Subscribe and stick around. So let us start with something that will reframe everything you think you know. A woman in medieval England did not even realize she was pregnant for months. There were no tests, no strips to dip in a cup, no doctor to confirm what was happening inside her body. The first sign most women recognized was something called the quickening. That is the moment when the baby first moves inside the womb. And that did not happen until roughly 5 months into the pregnancy. Think about that. For almost half the pregnancy, many women simply did not know. Some medieval medical texts offered earlier clues. One method involved the woman urinating on grain seeds. If the barley sprouted first, the child would be male. If the wheat sprouted first, a girl. If nothing sprouted at all, she was not pregnant. And before you laugh, modern researchers have actually found that pregnant women's urine does contain hormones that can promote seed growth. Other pregnancy tests were more creative. One medieval text advised a woman to drink a mixture of honey water before bed. If she experienced cramping in her abdomen overnight, she was with child. Another suggested inserting a clove of garlic and checking whether the taste reached her mouth by morning. The theory was that a pregnant womb would be sealed and block the flavor from traveling upward. The understanding of conception itself was deeply shaped by ancient ideas. Medieval physicians inherited Galen's theory of the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and applied it to reproduction. They believed that both men and women produced seed and that successful conception required the mingling of both. Some texts even suggested that a woman could not conceive without experiencing pleasure, a belief that would have troubling legal consequences for centuries. There was also a widespread belief that parents could influence the sex of their child through diet, timing, and position. Want a boy? Eat hot, dry foods. Conceive when the wind blew from the north. Sleep on your right side afterward. Want a girl? The opposite of everything. Cold foods, south wind. Left side, none of this worked. Of course, but it reveals how desperately medieval people wanted to understand and control something that remained fundamentally mysterious to them. The quickening was not just a physical milestone. It was a legal one. In English common law. The quickening was the moment when the unborn child was considered to have a soul. Before that point, the pregnancy barely existed in the eyes of the law. After it, the child was a person with spiritual rights. A mother could not be executed while carrying a quickened child. The baby inside her had legal protection that the mother herself sometimes lacked. This also meant that the first 5 months of pregnancy existed in a strange twilight. The woman might suspect something was different. Her monthly bleeding had stopped. She felt nauseous in the mornings. Her body was changing in ways she could not ignore. But without the quickening, without that unmistakable flutter of movement, nothing was certain. Medieval culture had no concept of taking a test and knowing immediately. Certainty arrived on its own schedule, and once the pregnancy was confirmed by the quickening, the community mobilized. Neighbors began checking in. Older women who had given birth multiple times offered advice. The midwife was contacted, sometimes months in advance, to ensure her availability in wealthier households. Special foods were prepared, rooms were designated, and supplies were gathered. The coming birth was not a private medical event. It was a communal undertaking that required planning, resources, and the coordinated effort of an entire network of women. But here is the thing. Once a woman knew she was carrying a child, her entire world shifted. And not just physically. There was a whole hidden infrastructure waiting for her. A network of knowledge, ritual, and support that had been refined over centuries, passed from woman to woman in whispered conversations that men were never supposed to hear. Because childbirth in the medieval world was women's business. Completely. Absolutely. Men were not just discouraged from participating, they were forbidden. In 15th century Belgium, a man named Henny van den Dam was fined 15 livres simply for hiding behind a staircase to listen to his own wife giving birth. That was not an unusual punishment. It reflected a deep cultural belief that the birthing chamber was sacred female space. The medical knowledge of the ancient world, built on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates and Aristotle, focused almost entirely on men. Women's bodies were considered a separate mystery, and that mystery belonged to women. The person who held the real power in that room was the midwife, and calling her just a midwife actually undersells what she was. She was doctor, counselor, pharmacist, and priest, all wrapped into one. In an age when male physicians refused to examine female patients below the waist, the midwife was often the only medical professional a woman would ever see. She had to be a woman of exceptional character. Many towns required midwives to swear formal oaths. They promised not to keep the umbilical cord or placenta, materials that people feared could be used in witchcraft. They promised to serve rich and poor alike, and they promised to call for a male surgeon only in the most extreme emergencies. We actually know some of their names, English poll tax records from the late 14th century list women like Matilda Kember and Felicia Tracy as professional midwives in their communities. In France, a woman named Bourgot Lear served as midwife to the Queen herself. Asseline Alexandra attended the Duchess of Burgundy during her delivery in 1373. These were not anonymous folk healers working in obscurity. They were recognized professionals with reputations, clients, and standing in their communities. The path to becoming a midwife was long and demanding in most cases. A young woman would apprentice under an experienced practitioner for years, attending dozens or even hundreds of births before she was trusted to manage one on her own. She learned to read the signs of a normal labor and, more importantly, to recognize when something was going wrong. She learned which herbs accelerated contractions and which ones slowed bleeding. She learned how to position her hands to guide a baby through the birth canal and how to feel for the cord wrapped around its neck. In some cities, the midwife's competence was formally tested. Municipal authorities in German cities began requiring examinations by the 15th century. Regensburg established medical licensing in 1452, and while that system would eventually be used to exclude women from practice, in its early years, it recognized midwifery as a legitimate profession requiring demonstrated skill. The midwife was not a last resort. She was the first and most trusted medical professional most women would ever encounter. The midwife's knowledge came from generations of oral tradition passed from mother to daughter, mentor to apprentice. But there were also written texts. The most famous was called the Trotula, a compendium of women's medicine written in 12th century Salerno, Italy. And here is where it gets really interesting. Salerno was the center of medical learning in medieval Europe. And unlike almost everywhere else, women were admitted as both students and teachers. A healer named Trota of Salerno became one of the most respected medical practitioners of her era. Her writings on childbirth included remarkably practical advice that physicians would not rediscover for centuries. The Salerno Medical School was unique in the medieval world. While the universities of Paris and Oxford and Bologna were exclusively male, Salerno drew on older traditions from the Arab and Greek world that recognized women's expertise in healing. The women who studied and taught there were sometimes called the Ladies of Salerno, and their influence extended across Europe through the texts they produced and the students they trained. The Trotula Compendium was not a single book, but a collection of 3 texts. One dealt with women's medicine generally, another focused on cosmetics and personal care. The third, and most relevant to our story, was called On Treatments for Women, and it was essentially a practical manual for midwives. Over 130 Latin manuscript copies survive. At least 60 translations into vernacular languages have been found. For 3 centuries, it was the most widely read text on women's health in the Western world. Trota emphasized preventing tears during delivery by pressing a folded linen cloth against the perineum. She provided detailed instructions for stitching tears if they occurred. This is the first written description of that particular surgical repair in all of medical literature, and the technique she described is remarkably similar to what doctors use today. But the Trotula also reveals the limits of medieval understanding. It described a condition called choked womb, where spoiled seeds supposedly clogged a woman's reproductive system. The recommended treatments included anointing with oils, herbal mixtures in wine, and in one memorable passage, a powder made from fox testicles. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of genuine insight and complete fantasy, but we should be careful about laughing too quickly. The same text that recommended fox testicle powder also contained the first written description of perineal repair surgery. The same tradition that believed in humoral theory also developed herbal pain management that contained genuinely effective compounds. Medieval practitioners did not have the luxury of separating the useful from the useless. They worked with everything they had, tested what they could, and passed on what seemed to work. Their batting average was lower than modern medicine, but it was far higher than 0. The Trotula also addressed the emotional aspects of pregnancy and birth in ways that were unusually compassionate for the era. It acknowledged that women sometimes felt shame about their bodies and advised practitioners to be sensitive to their patients' dignity. It recommended that difficult conversations happen privately. It understood that the relationship between a healer and a vulnerable patient required trust, discretion, and respect. In an era when most medical texts treated women as defective versions of men, the Trotula treated them as whole human beings deserving of skilled and sensitive care. Now, as the birth approached, something remarkable happened. The pregnant woman withdrew from the world. Noble women called this taking her chamber. The common woman might simply retreat to a back room. But regardless of wealth, the ritual was surprisingly similar across social classes. Tapestries were hung over the windows to block out light. The room was made dark and warm. Sweet-smelling herbs and incense were burned, so their vapors could reach the mother rosemary, lavender juniper. The air itself was considered medicine. And in that darkened space, surrounded only by other women, the mother waited. This was not a hospital. There were no hospitals for childbirth in the Middle Ages. This was her home, transformed into a protected space. The women who gathered were called gossips, a word that originally meant godparent or close female friend. It only acquired its modern meaning of idle chatter later, possibly because men resented the secret conversations happening behind those closed doors. The gossips were not passive observers. Each woman had a role. Some prepared food and drinks for the laboring mother. Others heated water and kept the fire stoked. Older women who had given birth many times served as living repositories of experience, offering advice and encouragement. The atmosphere was designed to be calm, supportive, and entirely female. No male voices, no male authority. In the medieval birthing chamber, women governed everything. This female space had a social function that went far beyond the medical. The birthing chamber was one of the only places in medieval society where women gathered without male oversight. The conversations that happened there about marriage, about bodies, about sex, about survival, were conversations that could happen nowhere else. The knowledge shared in those rooms was women's knowledge, and it was guarded fiercely. And behind those doors, the midwife brought everything she had: herbal concoctions to speed labor, oils to ease the passage, knowledge of how to turn a breech baby with her hands, birth stools that allowed the mother to labor upright, which modern science now confirms increases blood flow and shortens delivery. These women were practicing evidence-based medicine. They just did not call it that. The herbal preparations were extensive and surprisingly specific. Mugwort, known as the mother of herbs, was used to ease contractions and cleanse the womb. Pennyroyal was applied for pain. Fenugreek and frankincense were common ingredients. Galbanum was dissolved in goat's milk and given to women who needed to expel a dead child from the womb. Many of these plants contain compounds with genuine pharmacological effects. The medieval midwife was not guessing. She was drawing on a tested pharmacopoeia. If labor stalled, the midwife had options. She might have the mother walk around the room. She might prepare drinks with specific herbal combinations known to strengthen contractions. She might massage the belly with warm oils. For a baby stuck in the wrong position, she would reach in and physically manipulate the child, turning it with practiced hands. This was dangerous work that required extraordinary skill and nerve. The midwife also managed the mother's pain. There was no anesthesia, no epidural, no morphine drip. Instead, there were herbal preparations, warm compresses, and something we might now call psychological support. The women gathered in the birthing chamber sang, prayed, and told stories. They distracted the laboring mother. They held her hands. They reminded her that they had survived this too. The birth stool itself deserves attention. It was a specially designed chair with a crescent-shaped opening in the seat. The mother sat upright or slightly reclined, gripping the handles while the midwife worked below. Variations of this design have been found across virtually every culture in history, from ancient Babylon in 2000 BC to medieval Europe. And here is something that might surprise you. The idea of lying flat on your back during delivery is actually a relatively modern invention, likely popularized when male doctors took over obstetrics and wanted better visual access for thousands of years before that. Women gave birth upright. Gravity was their ally, not something to fight against. Now imagine what this experience actually felt like from the inside. You are in a darkened room. The air is thick with the smell of rosemary and burning juniper. Women you have known your entire life surround you, their faces lit by candlelight. Your mother might be there, your sister, your closest friend, the midwife who delivered your neighbor's baby last month, and your own mother 25 years before that, is telling you to breathe, telling you everything is normal, telling you she has seen this 1,000 times. The labor could last hours, sometimes days. First-time mothers often labored longest, as medieval midwives well knew. They called these women primipara and watched them more carefully. The midwife kept the mother moving as long as possible, walking circuits around the room, leaning against furniture, swaying from side to side. Movement helped the baby descend between contractions. The gossips told stories. They sang songs. They rubbed the mother's back with warm oils, scented with chamomile and lavender. They offered sips of wine mixed with honey and specific herbal preparations. One medieval text recommended a drink of powdered ivory in wine. Another suggested eagle dung dissolved in water. Not all the advice was equally sound, but the care behind it was genuine. When the contractions became continuous and the mother could no longer walk, she was guided to the birth stool. The midwife positioned herself below, hands ready, watching for the first sign of the baby's head. The women behind the mother supported her weight and held her arms. And in that moment, everything that the midwife had learned over years of apprenticeship came down to her hands, her experience, and her nerve. But here is where the story gets darker, because for all their skill, medieval midwives faced something that no amount of herbs or prayer could overcome: complications. And when things went wrong in the medieval birthing chamber, they went catastrophically wrong. The most terrifying scenario was obstructed labor. The baby could not fit through the birth canal. Maybe the child was positioned wrong. Maybe the mother's pelvis was too narrow, sometimes from childhood rickets caused by vitamin D deficiency. Whatever the reason, there was no surgical solution. No one was performing caesarean sections on living mothers. Hemorrhage was another killer. When bleeding started and would not stop, the midwife had limited options. She could apply pressure. She could use herbal compresses known to help clotting. She could massage the womb. But if the bleeding was catastrophic, if the placenta had torn or the uterus had ruptured, there was nothing anyone could do except pray. The mother would be dead within minutes. Some medieval texts describe these cases with a clinical detachment that barely conceals the horror underneath. Then there was puerperal fever, infection after delivery, what we now call sepsis, killed women days or weeks after births that had seemed perfectly normal. The baby was healthy, the mother appeared to recover, and then the fever came. Medieval practitioners called it childbed fever and recognized it as a distinct threat, but they had no concept of bacterial infection. They could not understand why some women who survived the birth itself died days later in agonizing pain. The midwife might try cooling compresses, herbal remedies, and prayer. None of it worked against an enemy no one could see. Uterine prolapse was yet another complication the midwife had to manage. If the womb descended after delivery, medieval texts prescribed elaborate treatments involving astringent herbs, careful repositioning, and long periods of bed rest. The Trotula contained surprisingly detailed instructions for addressing this condition. Another area where female practitioners had accumulated practical knowledge that male physicians simply did not possess. Caesarean sections in the Middle Ages were performed only on women who had already died. The goal was not to save the mother, it was to save the baby's soul. The Church taught that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven. So when a mother died in labor, a barber surgeon would cut the child free so it could be baptized before it too perished. The theological reasoning behind this is worth understanding because it shaped everything. Medieval Christianity taught that original sin, inherited from Adam and Eve, contaminated every soul from the moment of conception. Baptism was the only remedy. Without it, the infant's soul was lost. Not damned to hell exactly, but consigned to limbo, an eternity of existence without ever knowing God. For medieval parents who believed this with absolute certainty, a baby dying unbaptized was not just a tragedy. It was a catastrophe that echoed through eternity. Think about that for a second. The theology of salvation was so urgent that laws mandated the procedure. The Senate of the Republic of Venice in 1608 imposed severe penalties on any doctor who failed to attempt it. As late as 1749, a Sicilian physician was condemned to death for not performing a post-mortem caesarean section on a woman who died in childbirth. These were not empty threats. They reflected a society that genuinely believed that the few minutes between a mother's death and her unborn child's death were the most spiritually consequential moments possible. A surgeon who hesitated, who was squeamish, who arrived too late, had not just failed a patient, he had condemned an innocent soul. The pressure on medieval medical practitioners in these situations must have been overwhelming. The first recorded Caesarean on a living mother, where both survived, comes from Switzerland in 1500. A pig farmer named Jacob Neuffer performed it on his wife after several days of failed labor and 13 midwives. Who could not deliver the baby. He got permission from local authorities, used his livestock tools, and somehow both mother and child lived. She went on to have 5 more children naturally, but that story was not recorded until 82 years after it supposedly happened. So historians question whether it actually occurred. What we know for certain is that surviving a caesarean section before modern surgery was virtually impossible. The procedure meant death for the mother in nearly every case. Now, let us talk about the numbers. because the mortality statistics around medieval childbirth are often wildly exaggerated. You will read that 1 in 3 women died in childbirth. That figure appears on countless websites and even in some academic papers. But recent scholarship suggests it is dramatically wrong. A study from the Cambridge Group for the History of Population found that the maternal death rate per individual delivery was around 1.2%. That is roughly 1 in 83 births, high by modern standards. Certainly, today it is about 1 in 10,000, but it was not the catastrophic 1 in 3 figure that gets repeated. The confusion comes from a different statistic. Over a lifetime of multiple pregnancies, roughly 1 in 18 married women would eventually die from a childbirth-related cause. That is the cumulative risk of facing the danger 6, 8, even 12 times. Each individual birth was survivable, but the repeated exposure added up and the risk was not evenly distributed. First-time mothers faced the greatest danger, women with narrow pelvises, often the result of malnutrition or rickets during childhood, were at much higher risk of obstructed labor. Women who had experienced complications in previous deliveries were more likely to face them again. The midwife knew all of this from experience. She could look at a pregnant woman and make a reasonable assessment of how difficult the delivery might be based on the size of the baby, the shape of the mother's body, and her history. Interestingly, wealth did not offer much protection. Studies of elite women in medieval England show maternal mortality rates almost identical to those of common women, roughly 1.2% per birth. A queen died in childbirth for the same reasons a peasant did. The baby was too large. The labor went on too long. The bleeding would not stop. All the silk sheets and royal physicians in the world could not change the basic biology of human reproduction. To put these numbers in perspective, the modern maternal mortality rate in the United Kingdom is roughly 13 per 100,000 births. That is about 1 in 8,000. A medieval woman was nearly 100 times more likely to die in childbirth than a woman giving birth in a modern hospital today. The gap is enormous, but it is not the gap between civilization and barbarism. It is the gap between a world with antibiotics, blood transfusions, and emergency surgery, and a world without them. And this is why medieval women took such extraordinary spiritual precautions, because even if the odds of surviving any single birth were in your favor, the stakes were absolute. You either lived or you did not. There was no intensive care unit waiting if things went sideways, so women turned to the only safety net they had: faith. The patron saint of childbirth was Saint Margaret of Antioch, and her story explains everything about how medieval women understood the terror and miracle of bringing life into the world. According to legend, Margaret was swallowed by Satan in the form of a dragon, but the cross she carried grew enormous inside the creature, bursting it open and freeing her unharmed. The symbolism was not subtle. A woman consumed by an overwhelming force, trapped inside something terrifying, and then through divine intervention, emerging alive. Every medieval woman in labor understood exactly what that story meant. Saint Margaret had survived being inside the beast. They prayed she would help them survive their own ordeal. And the prayers were not just whispered words. They were physical objects. One of the most remarkable artifacts of medieval childbirth is the birthing girdle. These were long strips of parchment, sometimes 3 meters long, covered in prayers, religious symbols, and invocations for safe delivery. Women wrapped them around their bellies during labor, but the girdles were only part of a larger spiritual arsenal. Relics were brought into the birthing chamber: a splinter of bone from a saint, a scrap of cloth from a holy garment, a vial of water from a sacred well. Churches loaned these items out to laboring women the way a modern hospital lends equipment. In Westminster Abbey, the monks maintained a collection of relics specifically designated for use during childbirth, including a girdle said to have belonged to the Virgin Mary herself. Gemstones were also believed to have protective powers. Jasper was thought to speed delivery if held against the thigh. Eagle stone, a hollow rock with a smaller stone rattling inside, was pressed against the belly during labor. The rattling stone within the stone was an obvious metaphor for the child within the womb, and medieval women believed it could draw the baby out. These eagle stones were so valuable that they were listed in wills and passed down through families for generations. In 2021, researchers at Cambridge University made an incredible discovery. Using protein analysis on a 15th century birthing girdle from the Wellcome collection, they found traces of cervico-vaginal fluid embedded in the parchment fibers. Alongside that, they detected honey, milk, eggs, and plant proteins, substances documented in medieval texts as childbirth remedies. The girdle was not just carried or displayed, it was actually worn during active labor. The prayers were not decorative. They were being read aloud while a woman brought a child into the world. For 500 years, that piece of parchment held the physical evidence of someone's most desperate, most sacred, most human moment. A 15th century physician named Anthonius Guanerius wrote specific instructions about this. He said that, at the time of birth, it was good to have the legend of Blessed Margaret read aloud. The patient should have relics of the saints upon her, and the midwife should carry out familiar ceremonies in order to please the patient and, as he put it, the old women gathered around. Notice the quiet dismissiveness in that phrasing. To please the patient and the old women. The male physician knew these rituals mattered to the women involved, but viewed them as superstitious comforts rather than genuine medicine. And yet he recommended them anyway, because he also knew that a calm, supported, believing patient survived more often than a terrified one. If you are drifting off right now, that is completely fine. Let these stories settle into your mind, like the incense that filled those birthing chambers. There is no rush. Now let us talk about what happened after the birth, because the medieval experience of childbirth did not end when the baby arrived. For the mother, a whole new chapter of ritual and restriction was just beginning. And for the baby, the first hours of life were filled with practices that would seem bizarre to us today. The baby was bathed almost immediately. Then came swaddling, and medieval swaddling was nothing like the loose blanket wraps modern parents use. The infant was wound tightly in long strips of cloth, with arms pressed straight against the body and legs bound together. Medieval people believed that a baby's limbs were soft as wax and would grow into whatever shape they were held in. The trochlea was particularly concerned with the baby's ears, which were to be pressed flat and frequently shaped during the newborn period. There was also a peculiar belief that the length of the umbilical cord determined the length of the male genitalia. Honey and hot water were placed on the palate and tongue to help the child speak more clearly when older. The swaddling itself lasted months. Medieval infants remained tightly bound for much of their first year, gradually having one limb freed at a time, as the parents believed the bones had sufficiently hardened. When the swaddling was removed, the child was expected to begin crawling, and medieval texts advised parents to let this happen on a clean surface to prevent the child from eating dirt or harmful objects. Childhood was not a time of freedom, it was a time of careful management in a world full of dangers. But the most urgent matter in those first moments was not physical, it was spiritual. Baptism had to happen immediately. In the early Middle Ages, the Church encouraged baptism at Easter or Pentecost, but fears about the salvation of unbaptized children gradually pushed the practice earlier and earlier. By the 12th century, baptism on the day of birth was standard. And here is a detail that changes how you think about medieval women and power. The midwife was authorized to perform emergency baptism. It was the only sacrament a woman was ever permitted to administer. If the baby was clearly dying, the midwife could baptize it right there in the birthing chamber, saving its soul from what the Church taught was eternal separation from God. This authority was both a privilege and a burden. Church officials in the 14th century began instructing midwives on the proper form of baptism, testing them to make sure they knew the correct words. Getting it wrong was not just a professional failure, it was a spiritual catastrophe. An improperly baptized child was, in the eyes of the Church, lost forever. The selection of godparents was another matter of enormous importance. Godparents were not honorary figures the way they often are today. They were spiritual guardians who took on genuine responsibility for the child's religious education. The choice of godparents also established social networks and alliances between families. A wealthy godparent might support the child financially. A powerful one might offer protection. The negotiations around godparent selection sometimes began months before the birth and involved careful calculations of social advantage that would not have been out of place in a diplomatic summit. The baby's name was usually chosen by the godparents rather than the parents, a practice that underlines how communal medieval childhood really was. Many children were named after their godparents or after the saint on whose feast day they were born. Individuality in naming was not particularly valued. What mattered was connection to the community, to the Church, to the spiritual protection of a patron saint who would watch over the child throughout their life. For the mother, the weeks after birth were governed by a practice called lying in. She remained confined to the darkened room, attended by other women, for up to a month or more. She was not permitted to leave the house. She was not permitted to attend church. In some traditions, she was not even supposed to touch food that others would eat. The restrictions were remarkably specific. In some communities, the lying-in mother was not allowed to brew ale, knead bread, or draw water from the well. These were all activities that involved contact with substances the community consumed, and the idea that a woman fresh from childbirth could somehow contaminate them reflects both the ritual purity concerns of the era and perhaps a practical awareness that postpartum women were vulnerable to illness, and should not be overexerting themselves. Lying in happened in 3 stages. First, the mother was confined to bed for anywhere from 3 to 14 days. Then came the upsitting, when she could sit up and eventually move around the room. Finally, she could move about the house, but not venture outside. The entire process lasted until the churching ceremony, usually 40 days after the birth. Churching was one of the most important rituals in a medieval woman's life. Rooted in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, which described women as ritually unclean after giving birth, the ceremony marked her official re-entry into the community. She dressed in her finest clothes, wore a white veil, and was presented before the congregation by a priest, who sprinkled her with holy water. The ceremony itself followed a specific pattern. The woman waited at the church door, holding a lit candle. The priest met her there and led her inside by the hand. Prayers were spoken over her. Holy water was sprinkled, and then she was formally welcomed back into the community of worshippers. The white veil was significant. It echoed the baptismal garment, suggesting that the mother was, in a spiritual sense, being reborn herself. She had been through the valley of the shadow of death and returned. After the ceremony came the feast. Churching was a celebration, often the most lavish party the family could afford. The gossips who had attended the birth gathered again, this time for food and drink and storytelling. It was a social occasion as much as a religious one. Neighbors brought gifts. Ale was served. The women shared stories of their own births, their own fears, their own survival. In that room, over bread and wine, the communal experience of childbirth was honored and reinforced. Now, you might hear that and think it sounds oppressive. A woman being declared unclean after the sacred act of bringing life into the world, and many modern scholars have read it that way. But there is another interpretation that has gained traction. The enforced rest of lying in was possibly the only extended break from work that a medieval woman would ever receive. In a world where women worked constantly, from dawn until dark, every single day, the lying in period was a mandated rest. The community brought food. Other women handled her responsibilities. She had time to heal, time to bond with her baby, time to simply stop. Some historians argue that women actually valued the churching ceremony as a celebration, rather than experiencing it as a humiliation. But here is the thing that makes all of this so much more complicated. While the mother lay recovering, her baby faced dangers that no amount of prayer could prevent. Infant mortality in medieval Europe was staggering. An estimated 25% of children died before their first birthday. Half as many again between age 1 and 4. A quarter of all babies born simply did not survive to see their 5th year. The causes were everything you might expect. Infection, malnutrition during weaning, sudden illness, accidental smothering in the family bed, something medieval texts warn about repeatedly, and of course the diseases that swept through crowded medieval towns without any effective treatment. A healthy birth was only the beginning of a gauntlet. The family bed was itself a battleground. Medieval families slept together for warmth, often on a single large mattress stuffed with straw. Parents, children, and sometimes servants all shared the same sleeping space. The risk of a tiny infant being suffocated by a sleeping adult was real and constant. Church authorities preached against it. Penitentials prescribed punishment for parents found guilty of overlaying their children. And yet the practice continued because heating was expensive and beds were limited, and there was simply no other option. Weaning was another critical danger point. Medieval infants were typically breastfed for 1 to 2 years. When solid food was introduced, it was often pre-chewed by the mother or nurse and placed directly into the baby's mouth. The transition from breast milk to adult food exposed the child to contaminated water, spoiled grains, and foods their digestive systems were not ready to handle. Diarrheal diseases killed thousands of medieval children during this vulnerable period. The parents watched helplessly as their child wasted away from what they called flux, a condition they could diagnose but never treat. And this reality shaped everything about how medieval people related to their children. For generations, historians assumed that high infant mortality made medieval parents emotionally detached. Why bond with a child who might die next week? But recent scholarship has thoroughly dismantled that idea. Grief is grief. Loss is loss. Medieval parents mourned their children with devastating intensity. We know this from their desperate efforts to bury unbaptized infants in consecrated ground, defying church law. We know it from the eaves drip burials, where parents placed their dead babies along the northern walls of churches, hoping that rainwater falling from the roof would provide a kind of posthumous baptism. These were not the actions of people who did not care. Archaeologists have found these burials across Europe. In some cases, tiny bodies were placed in soap boxes that served as coffins. In others, infants were secretly slipped into the graves of recently buried adults, hidden beneath the adult coffin where no one would look. Parents broke the law and risked punishment, because the alternative, burying their child in unconsecrated ground like a criminal, was unbearable. The church said these babies could not enter heaven. The parents buried them in the shadow of the church anyway. For wealthier families, another danger lurked in the form of wet nursing. Medieval aristocratic women, and even some middle-class families, sent their newborns away to be nursed by other women. The reasons were practical and economic. A woman who was breastfeeding was less likely to conceive, and noble families needed heirs. Sending the baby to a wet nurse meant the mother could become pregnant again sooner. But wet nursing carried enormous risks. The wet nurse's own milk quality depended on her health and diet. The journey to the nurse's home exposed the infant to cold and illness. Some nurses took on more babies than they could properly feed. Medieval moralists railed against the practice, warning that the nurse's temperament and character could be transmitted through her milk, a belief rooted in humoral theory. They argued that a mother who sent her baby away was abandoning her natural duty. But the economic pressures of noble succession often won out over maternal instinct. If you are drifting off now, let these stories settle. There is no rush. These women and their children have waited centuries to be remembered. A few more minutes will not matter. Now, there is one more dimension of medieval childbirth that we need to explore. And it is perhaps the darkest. The connection between midwifery and witchcraft accusations, because the same knowledge that made a midwife invaluable could also make her a target. The regulations on midwifery and the early witch trials occurred during overlapping periods. Midwives swore oaths promising not to use portions of the birth in witchcraft. They were supervised by church-appointed monitors. And when natural remedies unknown to the general public produced results that seemed impossible, the question started. How did she know to do that? Where did that knowledge come from? The historians' debate around this connection is fierce and ongoing. Some argue that midwives were systematically targeted because the male medical establishment feared their knowledge and influence. Others point out that actual prosecution records show midwives were accused of witchcraft no more frequently than women in other professions. The truth, as usual, is more complicated than either side admits. What we can say is this: the midwife occupied an impossible position. She was essential and she was suspect. She held knowledge that could save lives. Knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries by women who taught other women in spaces where men were forbidden. And in a world where the church claimed authority over all matters of life and death, that kind of independent female knowledge was inherently threatening. Consider the specific fears that swirled around birth materials. The placenta and the umbilical cord were objects of intense anxiety. Medieval people believed that in the wrong hands, these could be used to curse the child, to bind its fate, or to work dark magic against the family. This is why midwives swore oaths promising to dispose of them properly. This is why the birthing chamber was locked. The same substances that were sacred in one context were terrifying in another, and if a baby died, if a birth went wrong and the child did not survive, the questions could turn deadly. What happened in that room? What did the midwife do? Was the wrong herb used? Was an invocation spoken to the wrong spirit? In an age when unexplained death demanded an explanation, and an explanation demanded a villain, the midwife was dangerously vulnerable. Her power to save was inseparable from her suspected power to harm. And then, starting in the late medieval period and accelerating into the Renaissance, something changed. Male physicians began claiming authority over childbirth itself. The Trotula, that groundbreaking text from 12th century Salerno, was gradually attributed to a male author. The name Trotula was dismissed as a title rather than a woman's name. The female voice at the heart of the most important obstetric text in European history was erased. It took modern scholarship, particularly the painstaking work of historian Monica Green, in the late 20th century, to restore Trota of Salerno to her rightful place. Green spent decades comparing manuscript variants, tracing textual lineages, and proving that the original author was indeed a woman. For 800 years, one of the most accomplished medical practitioners of the Middle Ages had been written out of her own story. Her knowledge survived. Her name was almost lost. Medical licensing, which originated around 1452, required credentials that women could not obtain because universities did not admit them. One by one, the doors that had been opened to female healers in the early Middle Ages were closed. The midwife, who for centuries had been the undisputed authority in the birthing chamber, gradually became subordinate to the male physician who had never witnessed a normal delivery in his life. By the 17th century, male surgeons were complaining in their own textbooks that female midwives summoned them only when it was already too late, when nothing could be done to save the patient. What they did not acknowledge was that for centuries, those same midwives had handled the vast majority of births successfully without any help from men at all. The instrument that ultimately gave male physicians their claim to superiority was the obstetric forceps. In the early 1600s, a family called the Chamberlains in England invented a device that could grip a baby's head and guide it through the birth canal during obstructed labor. And then they did something extraordinary. They kept it secret. For over a century, the Chamberlain family maintained a monopoly on this life-saving technology. When they attended a birth, they arrived with the forceps concealed in a gilded box. They blindfolded the laboring mother so she could not see what they were doing. They sent everyone else out of the room. The secret was so closely guarded that even other physicians did not know how the Chamberlains achieved their remarkable success rates. Only after the family's monopoly finally ended in the early 1800s did the forceps become widely available. By then, the message was clear. Male surgeons had tools. Midwives had only their hands. Think about that for a second. An entire system of women's medical knowledge, developed and refined over at least 1,000 years, practiced in secret rooms by trusted practitioners who answered to no one but other women, was slowly deliberately replaced by men who had to learn everything from scratch. And some of what those men introduced was not just unhelpful, it was deadly. When childbirth moved from the home into the hospital in the 18th and 19th centuries, maternal mortality actually increased. Doctors carried infections from patient to patient on unwashed hands. The lying in hospitals became death traps. In some institutions, the death rate reached 85 per thousand, far higher than what midwives had achieved for centuries in women's own homes. A Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered the reason in 1847. Doctors were going straight from performing autopsies on dead patients to delivering babies without washing their hands. When Semmelweis introduced mandatory hand washing with chlorinated lime solution, the death rate in his maternity ward dropped from over 10% to under 2% almost overnight. And for this discovery, he was ridiculed by his colleagues, fired from his position, and eventually committed to an asylum where he died at the age of 47. The medieval midwife who insisted on washing her hands in herbal water before attending a birth was practicing better medicine than the university-trained physicians, who replaced her 3 centuries later. She did not know why cleanliness mattered. She simply knew from generations of accumulated observation that it did. The honest answer: medieval childbirth was not the primitive nightmare we imagine. It was a sophisticated woman-centered system built on generations of accumulated knowledge, spiritual support, and community care. It had real limitations. Absolutely. There were no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no emergency surgery. But within those constraints, medieval women and their midwives had developed practices that were remarkably effective. The birth stool that used gravity, the herbal preparations that eased pain, the turning of breech babies by skilled hands, the perineal support that prevented tearing, the emotional comfort of being surrounded by women who had been through the same experience, the prayers and girdles that provided psychological strength when physical medicine had done all it could. Modern science has validated some of these practices. Upright birthing positions do reduce complications. emotional support during labor does improve outcomes. Certain herbal remedies like mugwort, which the Trotula called the mother of herbs, do contain compounds that affect uterine contractions. Even the birthing girdles, those supposedly superstitious strips of parchment, served a real function as what we would now call anxiety management tools. In fact, the modern doula movement, where trained women provide continuous emotional and physical support during labor, is essentially a rediscovery of what medieval gossips did naturally. Studies published in respected medical journals have shown that continuous female support during labor reduces the need for pain medication, shortens delivery time, and decreases the rate of cesarean sections. The medieval birthing chamber, with its circle of experienced women surrounding the mother, was providing evidence-based care centuries before the term existed. The movement to restore midwifery to the center of maternity care is one of the most significant developments in modern obstetrics. In the Netherlands, midwives still attend the majority of births in the United Kingdom. The National Health Service has expanded midwife-led care units, specifically because outcomes improve when birth is treated as a natural process rather than a medical emergency. The medieval midwife would recognize these spaces immediately. The warm lighting, the comfortable positions, the absence of unnecessary intervention, the trust in the woman's body to do what it has done since the beginning of our species. And here is something to consider as you lie there tonight. Every single human being alive today descended from an unbroken chain of successful births. Every one of your ancestors, stretching back through the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages, was delivered by a woman who knew what she was doing. The midwife at each birth was part of a tradition older than writing, older than civilization, older than agriculture itself. Some of those births happened in the darkened chambers of English manor houses, with tapestries blocking the light and the legend of Saint Margaret being read aloud. Some happened in simple cottages where the midwife was also a neighbor and a friend. Some happened in absolute emergencies where a baby came too fast, and the only help available was the woman next door who had delivered her own 6 children and knew exactly what to do. And each time, against odds that we would consider unacceptable today, most of them survived. Most of those babies drew breath. Most of those mothers lived to see the churching ceremony 40 days later, to walk back into the church wearing their white veils, to be welcomed back into the world they had briefly left behind. We have gained so much since those days: antiseptic technique, surgical intervention, antibiotics, blood transfusions, fetal monitoring, the ability to save babies born months premature. Modern obstetric medicine is one of humanity's greatest achievements. The maternal mortality rate in the developed world is now roughly 100 times lower than it was in the Middle Ages. But in that relentless march of progress, something was also lost. The birthing chamber as sacred female space, the midwife as autonomous healer, the community of women who gathered to support each other through the most profound experience of their lives. The understanding that giving birth was not just a medical event, but a spiritual, communal, and deeply human one. And that 500-year-old birthing girdle in the Wellcome collection, that strip of parchment still carrying the proteins of a woman who wrapped it around herself and prayed while she brought another life into the world, It is not just an artifact, it is a message from someone who was terrified and brave at the same time, someone who trusted her midwife, her God, and her own body to carry her through. We do not know her name. We do not know if her baby survived. We do not know if she herself lived to see the churching ceremony, or if that strip of parchment was all that remained of her. But we know she was there. We know she was real, and 5 centuries later, the evidence of her courage is still embedded in the fibers of the parchment she held against her body. That is what giving birth was really like in medieval times. Not the screaming spectacle of Hollywood movies, not the helpless suffering of popular imagination, but a complicated, dangerous, deeply human experience, navigated by women who were far more knowledgeable, far more capable, and far braver than history has given them credit for. If you are still awake, subscribe and stick around. There are more stories like this waiting for you, and if you have already drifted off, sleep well. Tomorrow the world will still be full of mysteries, and the women who came before us will still be waiting to have their stories told.